Great. I'm happy to just do a quick introduction to our next speaker, changing gears from stream sides and riparian habitats to forests and woodlands. Brad Withrow-Robinson is the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Agent for Benton, Lynn, and Polk counties. He works with a diverse audience of family forest landowners, forestry professionals, farmers, and conservation groups, and others to help discover, understand, and apply practical information helpful in taking care of woodland resources. Lately, he's been known to go on and on about taking care of and thinning young stands to enhance habitat diversity and other subjects. With that, we're very happy to welcome Brad Withrow-Robinson. Thanks so much for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael. And I will see about sharing my screen. Okay. So hello, everybody. And good to see some familiar names and faces here. Lee and Lisa and Katie and Steve, and then some others that I may know but don't recognize. So it's good to be here. Yeah, my name is Brad, W-R, Withrow-Robinson. And I'll talk a little more about some of the things I do with extension, which I think would be important. I understand you guys had one of my colleagues, I think Melissa Ferry was here a week or two ago. So, you know, not everyone knows extension. It's usually worth explaining a little bit about what we do. And in the different programs, we do some pretty different things. But if you would indulge me, I would be interested in knowing a little bit about who's here, and if you would, or how many of the folks here actually have some woodlands. I know this is a very mixed class. We have ag, you know, the whole watershed has a bunch of different territory. So if we've done this in some other classes where you just put into chat your name and how many, let's just say how many wooded acres you have. And then I can read the chat things as they come across, though I don't see a chat button at the moment. And I'll learn a little about the class. So just take a second and type in.
Where?
Brad, if you look at the top of your screen, that's usually where the speaker's chat function will show up.
Okay.
What did you say? We're not talking.
Does other people have a chat? Well, this may not work. I'm not. Has anyone typed it? Because sometimes, usually it just pops up and becomes visible to me and I can read as it comes. But
Yeah, Brad, I'm happy to read just some of the responses that are coming in. Emily say that they have 27 acres. Lisa's got 4 wooded acres. Jackie, about 5 acres. Another says no acres, but landscape architecture student wanting to focus on habitat conservation. Travis says our family has 25 acres of timberland. And someone has a stand of overgrown Christmas trees that were planted a long time ago. It's about a half an acre.
And okay. Yvonne has 4 acres.
All right. Well, that gives me just some sense, and I'm guessing most everybody is actually from the watershed area, or, you know, nowadays in Zoom, Michael, you can have people from anywhere. So no, I'm getting a head shake, a no. So we have people from outside the area. Well, let's talk a little bit about, bring my keyboard up to where I can reach it, see if this goes. So, let's talk a little bit about what I hope to do tonight. I was here last year and it seemed to be useful, so we're doing it again. And what I'm hoping to do tonight is really to be thinking about helping you to move forward on the planning process. And to do that, I'm interested in providing you some context about the planning process, things you want to, that I think would be helpful from my experience, that would be helpful for a person to be thinking about as they're doing it. And also help recognizing some opportunities and challenges you might have around some of the key topics. So it's very much oriented towards the process that you're engaged with with the Watershed Council. What it is not is it's not an introductory class to woodland management. We do those, happy to have some of you join those, but that's a longer process. It's typically a 6-session class or something like that to do our basic woodlands class. But again, I think the important thing for the planning process is to provide a little context about forest types, some of the things that happen here, and some of the issues that go into management and planning. So that's where we'll start and see where we go from there. So as we said, I work for OSU in the Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program. And so we work with family forest landowners, different community groups, even schools sometimes to help folks figure out what they want to do with their property and to manage it for the different objectives that they're interested in. So this is primarily an educational mission. We're part of OSU, and we are a key part of the land-grant university mission, which is to bring science-based information that comes from our or other universities and help apply it to real-world situations. Agriculture has been one of the main areas. We've been doing that for over a century, but in Oregon, forestry is an important part, and we actually have the largest forestry extension program in the country. So, to do this educational mission, then we work with different partners to identify some of the different needs for information. We develop educational programming, classes, tours, sometimes even applied research, and then we do a lot of publications. Michael and I can work on helping you find some links to them, but we do a lot of different publications, newsletters, blogs, and different ways to try to get information out to people. Education does also involve some one-on-one engagement and consultation or discussions. And we also have a volunteer group called Master Woodland Managers who help us engage communities and land and family forest landowners. So we have a pretty diverse way that we do this, but it is educational in the main, and that is in contrast with some of our sister agencies like Oregon Department of Forestry, which is also often involved in some education and will do more consultations and technology transfer than we will. And the U.S. Forest Service, which everyone knows of and thinks of if they say, oh, I'm going to talk to a forester. But both of those agencies have land management responsibilities. And in the case of Oregon Department of Forestry, they're very important in regulatory issues. And we'll talk about that a little briefly. So extension, I'm in a really sweet spot. I get to talk to landowners, listen to hear about the things that excite them, help them try to figure out how they want to make that work on their property, and work with them without having to be involved in the regulatory part. But regulation is part of it, so we do talk about that so that we keep you pointing in the right direction. So this is a map I've always enjoyed. This one is a map that shows different forest land ownerships in the state. And all the colors go along with where there are forests. You know, the forest land ownership is obviously only where we have the forest. So you can see big, vast areas in the southeast and up along the Columbia Basin that don't have much forest. And then the different colors there represent those different ownerships. The largest one that you see is that dark green, which is U.S. Forest Service. And I don't know if you can see my pointer. So this along the Cascades, and then there's Forest Service ground here in the Coast Range and out here. There's this lighter green color would be the private industrial forest land. And then this magenta color, that's you guys. All these little purple dots, that's the family forest landowner. That's the main audience that Oregon State University usually engages. I do work with Forest Service or ODF or industrial foresters, but that's more often as colleagues, and they may be my resource people to lead tours or provide me information. And you know, they all have their own sets of foresters. So my main, or Extension's main work audience are all these little purple dots, fuchsia dots. And what's interesting to notice here, up and down the Willamette Valley, and as you go south and over on the east side as well, is where those are. They're not the high elevation areas, and the Forest Service got a lot of the really high elevation, the high Cascades and stuff, beautiful country, not necessarily the most productive forests. The industrial grounds often involve these mid-elevation areas, very often very productive areas as far as biological productivity and timber productivity. And then the family forest landowners are really along the fringe, often in the more transitional ground between the valleys and the ag lands and the urban areas. So between those areas and the forested lands. And those are often the lands you often lay between the real population and the forested areas. So the family forest lands are often the lands that people see. They may recreate there, or at least those are the forests that they see and engage with often on a daily basis. So it's an important part of the landscape of Oregon as the family forest landowners. Also, not just because of where they are and the diversity of that area that they're in, but also the diversity of you folks as family forest landowners. I don't have a current number, but there's about 10,000 of you family forest landowners, and there's probably about 15,000 different management objectives among you. So you bring diversity of objective in a way that really doesn't exist on these other greens. You know, the Forest Service has a much less diverse management objective, and the industrial definitely has a different less diverse set of management objectives than typical family forest landowners do. So it's a very interesting group of people that I work with, and brings a lot of diversity. You'll also notice that my area includes, you know, stretches from the crest of the Coast Range or from well into the Coast Range, all the way across the valley and up into the crest of the Cascades. So 3 different bioregions. So that's another pretty significant driver for some of the diversity of the landscapes that I work with through different landowners. So part of the context, so that's a little bit about me, who I work for, Oregon State University, you and who I work with, which is different types of landowners, but primarily the family forest landowners. We'll talk more about some of that later. The other thing, which just to provide a little context, is it's fun to look at a map of Oregon and see how much diversity we have in the different forest types. And you know, you could go to whole states, well, there's smaller states, but you go to the southeast and there's really only one forest type across 5 or 6 different states altogether. And we have this diversity, which is pretty amazing. And it's driven by a lot of different things. Probably the strongest factor is global geography. You know, is the mountains, the moving of the plates, the creating of mountains, and the fact that we have an ocean right here and an airflow that carries across the state from west to east from the ocean. And as it moves this way, that airflow is pushed up over our different mountain ranges, the Cascades, which are fairly low and all created by uplift. And then, the Coast Range, which are fairly low and created by uplift. And then on to the Cascade Mountains, which are higher and are volcanic. And then on across some of our other mountain areas. And as each time that moist air from the ocean comes across and is lifted to go over mountains, then we get rainfall. And our forest types have a lot to do, probably more to do with rainfall than anything else. There's soil type differences as we go across, but the soil types have to do with the geography, how old they are, and rainfall. The moisture has a lot to do with what different soil types have formed over time. So we have this whole range of forest types. The wettest one along the very coast is a spruce hemlock zone. And then a big part of Western Oregon is a mixed conifer zone dominated by Douglas fir with more hemlock and cedar in the moisture areas. And then we get up into a subalpine fir dominated area before getting over to the more arid mountains here. So really a pretty cool set of different forest types and diversity. You've all seen it as you've driven across the Cascades, but it's nice to think about what drives that. And it's the topography and the weather that has to do largely with us being so close to the ocean. So most of us, I'm thinking, live along this, most of you in the class are probably living along this edge here of the Willamette Valley. Some of those little purple dots that we were looking at earlier, and are probably related to this Douglas fir dominated conifer mix here. But you will notice that there is a lack, there's not a forest type listed here in the Willamette Valley, and nor is there much discussion of hardwoods. And so we really probably ought to pause and think about what is, or at least was, in the Willamette Valley. Brian talked about changes that occurred in river structure, but there were also, as the river was channelized purposefully, the old side channels cut off to ease access or farming and so forth. But we made huge changes in the vegetation of the Willamette Valley too. Here on the left, we have a reconstruction, a very simplified reconstruction of the historic vegetative condition at about the time of European settlement, based on old land survey information. And it's dominated by 2 or 3 colors that we'll talk about in a moment. And here on the right, we see a very different set of colors here, showing the changes that have occurred in that 150 years or so. And I think this is 20-year-old map on the right, but I doubt it has changed a whole lot since. Here on the left, we're seeing a lot of this tan color and some olive colors, and those represent prairies. Wet prairies would be the lighter tan color, and the darker olive color would be savannas, which are essentially prairies with a scattering of trees in them. They were generally referred to as oak savannas because oak was the dominant tree species that were there, but that included some fir, certainly some ponderosa pine, and a few other rarer tree species would have been in there. But the real diversity in these communities, these prairie and savanna communities, were the shrubs and herbaceous, the grasses and the flowering plants that were part of it. And these prairies varied from being either a wet prairie or some dry prairies, and savanna areas as well. The 2 other colors that we see here are green. I guess seeing Brian set us up so well, you can see this meandering green line and know immediately that that's the gallery forests or the riparian forests of the Willamette River. And in that picture they showed of all those meanders that were there between Harrisburg and Eugene, that much of that area between those meanders would have been hardwood forests, cottonwood, ash, maple, and things like that. And in some places, some of the confluences like the Santiam and the Willamette right about here, they were pretty wide forested areas. And the main forested areas in the valley. Otherwise, it was very open with just scattered trees on the savannas. So we had a hardwood forest running down the heart of the valley. And then we also here see little bits of green on the outer edges, which would be the upper edges of this picture. And that light green represents what probably was mostly a closed canopy of conifers, Douglas fir forests. So very little Douglas fir or closed canopy forest down on the valley floor. Big changes when you've come over here to the right side is new colors. This orange color here is Portland Metro, Salem, Albany, Corvallis, and Eugene. So we have some very significant areas that are part of the Metro. We have the red areas, which are the ag, and then almost no tan and olive of prairie and savanna. They've pretty much disappeared, but we see a big increase in the areas that are now covered with conifers, including this edge here along the Cascades. And that change occurred because pre-settlement time, the native people were burning the Willamette Valley regularly. And that helped keep that regularly, meaning pretty much annually. And that helped keep that area open and dominated by herbaceous plants, grasses and flowers, and some shrubs, and only a few species of trees that could tolerate the fire. And so that's what it was. And the fires went up into the foothills enough that it kept that from turning into Douglas fir very quickly. What happens over here is with agriculture and European settlement, we stopped the fires, and like a fog coming out of the Coast Range, the conifers just sort of descended down the slopes and occupy now a much bigger part of our foothill areas around the valley than they ever did before. So many of you who live in some conifer areas along the valley, it may be important for you to recognize that that may be the first time there were conifers there. That may have been part of the historic savanna and prairie landscape. And some of you have areas that still have some hardwoods, some Oregon white oak, perhaps still a savanna, or at least some remnants from that previous condition. And some of you surely have some riparian areas and perhaps some of those hardwood forests still along them. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to mention there. So that's pretty much a little bit of context about some of the forest types in Oregon and kind of what drives it. Some of what's represented, including bringing it back home and putting it in some historic perspective. We're going to change gears in a minute. So I was going to ask if there are any questions, but then I found out that I can't see my chat. So if someone has a question that relates, now, as I say, that we're not talking about details of management, but if there's some question that kind of relates to this overview and context, type it into the chat, and Michael can interrupt me and say, hey, here's a question I think's relevant, and we can stop and deal with that. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. And we're going to start talking a little bit about the things that seem most relevant for you to be thinking about as you go through a planning process. And I'll deal with these in a somewhat orderly manner, but there'll be a little bouncing back and forth for sure. And the key things, first and foremost, are your objectives, being clear about what your objectives are and what your hoping to do. And that is, after all, what the purpose of the plan is to try to identify your objectives and work towards meeting them through a plan. It helps you identify the things that you have to do. Almost everyone talks about, if they have a forest, wanting to keep it healthy. And this seems a little out of order, because managing what matters to you is very much related to your objectives. We're certainly going to talk about fire preparedness. That needs to be part of any plan that you do. And we need to talk about playing by the rules. Forestry is a highly regulated form of land use, and you need to be aware enough of them to know what rules apply to you and what your obligations are as you do any different practices on your property. So let's skip on to this next one. Was there anything pressing there, Michael?
Well, there is a question, Brad, and you're welcome to field it if you'd like. Jackie asked, does anyone know what the forest types were before humans were here?
Yes. And before humans were here, the record that we can look at is, humans arrived, I don't know, 10 to 15,000 years ago. Before that, it was the glacial period. And so, but we have records from pollen samples in little lakes that can tell us a lot. So there is something. And vegetation, let's say it was vegetation type, because there weren't always forests here. But Douglas fir has been here since in the mountain areas since at least the glacial times. There was a lot of open grassland, and pine and fir have washed back and forth. So plants, what we can tell from that, it has not been static. We certainly know that this was a tropical region. If you go over to the John Day fossil beds, Oregon was once a tropical place. So depends on how far you want to go back, and if you want to talk to a geologist or a paleoecologist, you can find a lot of different things. But it has changed a lot, and since late glacial period on, it's looked a lot like this, but different species have been pushed up and back, north and south, as the climate has changed over those eons. So we'll leave
just to tack onto that, there's just that whole really cool discipline of paleobotany, which looks at those lake sediment cores for pollen deposits, and also old pack rat nests have a wealth of botanical information on what was there before people too. So really cool realm of study.
Cool. I'm not familiar with the pack rat stuff. So, but the ponds tell us quite a lot, and they're, tells you some very good general information, and it's pretty well understood as far as time sequences. Okay, so we're going to move on, and that first topic of things to consider in your planning had to do with your objectives. And this is an exercise that I do in most of my longer planning classes. We don't have time for it today, and hopefully you were doing, you likely did something similar to this at some point in this course, where you think about what it is that you're managing for. And so what we would do in our class is have different people pair up and talk with each other in the pairs about some of the things they know about their property and how they relate to it. They'll talk a little about the history. They'll describe the forest itself, what it's like, what they think it was like before. And then they'll also talk a lot about their relationship to their property, and particularly their forest, how they use it, why they like it, and then what they would like to see it be like in the future. And the purpose for this, so we'll stay right there. The reason we do this is because of the importance of knowing what your objectives are. and to be able to articulate them. And in fact, what we have here is, when we do this exercise, we'll have the two people each speak for 15 minutes. Michael would talk and I'd be taking notes for him, and then we'd switch and I'd talk and he'd take notes to me, and then we'd exchange our notes. And what we actually have there is the very fundamental, the very rudimentary parts of a plan, and perhaps the most important part, because most people have some ideas of what they're managing for, but they often don't write them down. And what you're doing now, and it's part of this management planning process, is really important, because you're actually getting some of these things that are important to you put down in a structured way. And this conversation is part of our process to get people doing that. Because until you get some of those things written down, it's hard to explain them to other people in your own family, or very importantly, to some of the people you may be hiring to help you accomplish things in your property. So identifying your objectives and recording them and being able to articulate them and share them with people is really key, and is the purpose of a management plan. And that management plan, again, it's your family and some of the contractors you'll work with. And if you're a person who's hoping that this property continues on in the family, then this is part of the tool, how you communicate so that that continuity of management can go on from generation to generation as well. So can't overstress the importance of it. Hopefully, and it will change. And for those of you who are more than one person, I hope you're already thinking and talking to other people in your family about these objectives and what's important to them, and have these conversations within your family as well. And anyway, that's the core of the management plan, is knowing what it is that you want. Another thing that people mention all the time, oh yeah, I was supposed to go back right here, and I listed down a few of the things that come up over and over in classes, but also in surveys that are done, some of the common priorities when we talk to landowners and ask them, well, what are your objectives for your property? Some of the really common ones are beauty, privacy, nature and wildlife, water quality and so on, recreation, family, investment, and timber. So pretty broad, and I would guess, you know, most of you checked off many of those. And what's interesting to notice among family forest landowners, and that was roughly in the order that they get listed, is beauty, privacy, and wildlife are often the very high end, and timber productivity and production are often way down the lower end. And the fact is that just about everybody, or almost nobody, ever mentions an objective. They have a whole suite of objectives, and they're trying to accomplish those different objectives at the same time on the same property, which is fine, especially if you have a little more property. But again, that's the other reason that we go through these exercises and talk about what your objectives are, because it helps you figure out where some of your objectives coincide or may clash. And this planning process and identifying your objectives as part of it is a really important way that you do that, and that you can then resolve some of those conflicts or find synergies and enhance some of those things that naturally come together. All right, so one of the other things that often comes up, it wasn't quite listed there, I think it was, but anyway, is forest health. People talk about, oh, I just want it. They used to say I wanted a natural forest. And then we started having that conversation about what forest types used to look like when Native Americans were burning and all, and people, well, maybe it isn't just natural, because then I couldn't have, you know, it gets more complicated, but everyone wants it to be healthy. And the problem with, you know, a healthy forest, that's a fairly subjective and also kind of an elusive term. You know, what is a healthy forest? One, it depends on your objective, right? How would that be? You have everyone wants a healthy forest. Well, it's sort of a degree of healthiness. So if you're growing Douglas fir as Christmas trees, which are a visual product, you have a very low tolerance for any insects or disease. So your objective, if you're growing Douglas fir Christmas trees, is to have a very, very low level of disease. If you're growing a 35-year-old rotation like Weyerhaeuser does of Douglas fir, you can get away with a little more because you're selling logs at age 35. You don't want them to have rot in them or anything, but if a tree or two dies, it's not a big deal. So you would expect a little bit more. If you're the Forest Service and you're trying to raise 300-year-old owl habitat, well, part of the habitat is to have diseases and dead trees and things like that. So what is considered healthy or tolerable or even desirable is going to vary a lot according to what the objectives of that landowner are. And some of the pathology people I talk to like to say clever things like a healthy forest has a healthy amount of disease. But it's kind of true, you know, especially if your objectives are more towards habitat. Diseases are often the mechanism that create habitat points, or, you know, those microhabitats, the hollow tree, the dead tree, the hollow tree, things like that. So we want to understand what makes a forest healthy, and it's going to vary a lot on where you are in the landscape and what your forest is. So I can't define that entirely, but what you're looking for is going to depend on your objectives, the type of forest that you have, and to some extent the site that you have. So here are some examples of things that don't look so healthy. Here on the left is a Douglas fir in the Willamette Valley, not far from Philomath, and it was growing great until the year that it wasn't. And it was this is a fairly old photo, but I could have taken it in the last couple of years because this was drought stress, and we've just survived. We're just hopefully finishing up a 5 or 6 year drought cycle in Western Oregon. We'll see if we're finishing it or not. But here's a Douglas fir that was planted on some marginally wet ground. It did great for 8 or 10 years. And then there was a weather pattern that was probably very wet in the spring, limiting early root growth. And then it turned hot and dry in the summer, and this tree died. So not a healthy tree, probably not a healthy forest, because that tree was probably not in the right place soil-wise and climate-wise to grow into a healthy area. Remember, much of this Willamette Valley was wet prairie before. And though Douglas fir very happily, well, we can plant them, but they also quite happily plant themselves in many places, they may not be suited to their long-term health. So what recognizing the capabilities and limitations of your site are an important part of it. And that's sort of the reminder of that. Then there's some other factors going on. I get calls every summer about this picture on the upper right, and it's bright green with these very reddish brown things. Obviously something horrible is happening to this oak tree. And it takes me a while sometimes to convince people this is a very natural and not very important, or not very damaging, not important to the health of the tree. This is a relationship between an oak, a little tiny wasp that forms galls under the bark, and the squirrels that come and eat the galls that are under the bark. So then they peel the bark off of the twig to get to the larva, and they kill the branch. So it's part of a relationship of a very well adapted tree to the area, oak, and some of the species that are very well adapted to live with it. And so, we sort that out, and we usually determine that that is inconsequential. We have the right tree for the space, and what we see going on is an interaction of different native organisms who are pretty well adapted to each other. And then down here at the bottom, we have some pictures that are beetles. And beetles are problematic because this beetle is a native beetle, and it's that one is probably the Douglas fir beetle. So it's one of the predators of our Douglas fir tree. And occasionally they become problematic under times of stress or disturbance like windstorm events that knock down huge amounts of trees. The population might build up and start attacking healthy trees, or like the last 5 years when the trees are, excuse me, when the trees are all under drought stress, the beetles are able to attack weakened trees. As I say, they're predators, but they're kind of weak predators. So they rarely, except in those outbreaks after a disturbance, they're rarely out attacking healthy trees. They're attacking the trees, the weak and dying trees. So we may see, I often get calls from people saying, hey, I have beetles attacking my trees. What do I do to get my healthy, how do I kill them? I want a healthy forest. The health of that forest comes back, but the beetles are there really as a symptom of the issue of some other deeper issue, drought, or like this tree over here, if it had grown a little longer, could have been beetle fodder because it was growing on the wrong site. So some of the things that we see going on are very natural, and this is a natural process, but it's often telling us that there's just a cycle of stress occurring from trees being in the wrong place, or trees that are generally in the right place being stressed by unusual weather patterns. And yeah, so here's some trees that were being lost in the early part of that drought cycle. And this is not what very few people would think of this as a healthy forest that they had in mind. And so what do we do? First, if you are planting or if you have property that have mixed species, one of the things you want to do is say, well, are these species appropriate for the site or the objectives that I have? And in the Willamette Valley, where people have planted to get a forest deferral, or trees have naturally spread into areas where they are excluded by past fire management, we sometimes end up with trees like Douglas fir on very wet ground that are just not really appropriate. And it may take 20 years, it may take 40 years for that to happen. Douglas fir can be a very long-lived tree in the mountains, but here it tends not to be. And then it's these episodic occurrences like a drought cycle that often does that, and then clarifies for the landowner, well, I guess this maybe wasn't a Douglas fir site. You know, those oak trees look really good. And there's a reason for that, because that oak was probably the more suitable thing. So if you've inherited a property, that stand of trees may be telling you something about your site, but you can, you will be given choices to perhaps favor the more appropriate species. And that is definitely something that you need to think about if you're planting a site and you are not inheriting a landscape or a forest, but you're creating one in the future.
Hey, Brad, we have a quick question that came up in chat.
Okay.
Where do we get the information on how much Douglas fir we can remove and still receive the forest deferral?
Okay, let's talk about that when we get to when we talk about the rules at the end. And so, how are we doing? We're getting close to the end, so I'll speed on, but let me address that a little later. So As Michael said in my introduction, I often talk to people about thinning and other tools. Thinning is one of the things that we use to enhance forest health by giving trees enough growing space to keep them out of stress. And yes, you have to stay within certain bounds to count as a forest, but management tools such as thinning are some of the key things we do to enhance forest health. But it's also how we shape the forest to manage for the different objectives that you have. And so one of the other very high goals for family forest landowners is habitat, wildlife and habitat. And it can develop naturally on its own, but if you came into a forest that was planted, in tight rows, it may take half a century or more for it to get there. And you as a landowner, land manager, can take action such as thinning or planting or different things to be trying to manage that property to get into the condition you're interested in. And thinning is among the tools that we have that, they can be used by a timber company to optimize timber production, but they're also, most importantly, tools that small landowners have to create or to choose, and very often to create diversity of habitat, diversity of structure, which is diversity of habitat. And so Lee always likes this slide because it has cookies in it, but it's one that I've used to illustrate some of the different types of structural diversity that we find in forests, and that are the things that we can manage for to create different kinds of habitats for different species. And we have, and so it comes down to management or different actions that you can take to try to enhance, if it's diversity you're after, it's trying to enhance the diversity according to the type of animals you're interested, that you have or interested in providing habitat for. And one of the important things that we tried to point out in this is that these opportunities to move towards your management objectives, in this case, habitat diversity, they occur throughout your ownership, throughout the life of a forest. Sometimes you have a bigger opportunity where you can make a really big change with just a few actions, and other times it's more incremental, but you can always be moving towards your different objectives throughout the time of your ownership in the life of a forest. Now, one of the things that I think everyone now understands since last September is that we live in a fire landscape, even here in Western Oregon. I think we've long had, people have had, long had an incorrect belief that, yeah, wildfire is really only an issue in other parts of the state, such as Bend, Ashland, LeGrand, those parts. But no, all of Oregon has a history of fire, and Western Oregon is no different. And so as rural landowners, many of you with forest land, your home's possibly tucked into that forest land because of the amenity that that represents. I'm gonna admit someone here. Hope it's one of us. It's just really important for you to be thinking about and building this into your plan. I mean, if you're going to be doing management planning, it has to include thoughts about fire. How you're going to try to prepare and avoid fire striking your home, and in perhaps a separate plan, how to make sure that you at least survive a fire if it comes to your property and your home. And we learned so much about that at a very personal level this year, right in Lynn County and to the two counties just north and south of us, the canyons and you know, the Mackenzie and the Santiam Canyon. So learning about fire issues, beginning with the personal space, the personal responsibility of your home. Are you prepared to survive a fire that begins in an electrical fire that begins in your home in the middle of the night? Do you know what to do to get you and your family out? Do you have a plan that if a wildfire comes, that you know what to do, how to escape with your family, your pets, your livestock? These are the things that we're better at if we plan. And so this planning process now must include that. And I'm not advancing for some reason. Okay, so here's an illustration of all the different ways fire can get in and attack a home. And so there's a lot of learning to be done, and it happens at different scales. I mean, the first place is to begin, as I said, with your home. Thinking about ready, set, go, very personal response to survival. But you can also do things to harden your home, to create defensible space around the home, to make the home also more likely to survive under certain fire conditions. And then step that up to your neighborhood and your community, because what someone is doing right across the fence often has a big impact, and eventually up to a larger landscape scale. And so OSU now has a new fire program, less than a year old. People start arriving right on the heels of the fire. And we've been doing a lot of work in response to the fires this fall. But starting this spring, we're going to be doing online fire preparedness program, which I would highly recommend for all of you who haven't yet taken that. It's going to begin with that personal in-home space and around the home, and then in successive sessions in the fall and next year, we'll start scaling up to the community networking and working with different agencies, NRCS, SWCD, Oregon Department of Forestry, whatever groups to help build out that personal and community fire survivability and fire preparedness. You'll have this, if you sign up for the Needle and Compass, searching for that, that's my newsletter and announcements, and that's one way that you can learn about these courses. And they'll begin in probably late March, early April, or we'll begin in March and go to mid-April, probably. Okay, playing by the rules. Need to close up here, and I remember there was a question. As I said, Oregon has, forestry is a highly regulated land use compared to most of our other land uses. And there's a lot of reasons in that. There's many different parts of that. Oregon Department of Forestry is, under statute, is required to regulate forest practices, commercial forest practices specifically. And by default, many of you, if you're growing timber, and especially if you have a forest deferral, well, though you may not be planning on harvesting your trees and may not think of yourself as a commercial producer, your forest deferral and other things imply that you are. So you are generally having to work under these forest guidelines. And so if you don't already have a copy of this, I would highly recommend that you get online and search for this title. Oregon Forest Resources Institute will send you one for free. And the book is an illustrated manual to the Forest Practices Guide, and will tell you a wide range of different things that you need to know if you're going to be managing, including many of the things that you might want to do to control weeds. Often controlling weeds if you're using any herbicides, or if you're doing any thinnings or other harvests, or ever working anywhere near streams or other water, you need to be aware that you're required to make a notification of operations. You're going to go spray weeds, or you're going to put in a bridge. You have to be working, notifying the Oregon Department of Forestry, and often developing a plan with them. This book will give you the overview, a very visual overview of that, including letting you know how many trees to the acre you might need. Generally, if you have, and when we're worried about how many trees to the acre we have as we plant, the regulations, if you've harvested or if it's been harvested and you're planting, the regulations require that you establish at least 200 trees that are free to grow within 6 years. As you're thinning down, those bigger trees have size and volume. So most people don't thin down to a point that gets them in trouble with the Oregon Forest Practices Act. If you thin enough, like in a shelterwood, then you may be triggered to have to replant, but that's allowable. And there's some calculations in here. Oh, I have a copy of it. It probably doesn't disappear. Yeah, disappears. I can hide behind it. So I love the green screen thing. So anyway, this is an essential thing for you to have. And again, it's useful and it was designed with the illustrations to be a tool for communication between you and your family. Oh no, this is what I'm talking about. I'm not gonna clear cut, I'm gonna do a patch cut. Don't worry, Dad. Or to talk to a contractor, someone who's coming in to do work on your property. That is meant for A, to help you understand it, and B, do it in a way that allows you to communicate. So strongly recommend that you get a copy of that, keep it in your vehicle or on your bookshelf, and get familiar with it because it's a very good resource. So closing here then, some of the important players, the different groups or agencies you might want to be familiar with, make yourself familiar with. OSU explained we have an educational role. We have all sorts of different publications and so forth, from a couple decades of work that generally relate to the things that you as a family forest landowner might be wanting to do in your property. Oregon Department of Forestry, also a very good source of information, but they are also the regulatory agency. And so for much of this, there are some things relating to streams and water that they are not. But if you're doing any work in the forest, you want to be communicating with them so that you are, even if you're spraying invasive weeds, that's an operation that requires notification. Great, go out and kill invasives, but if you're doing it in this way, they need to be notified. Forest Service doesn't generally do a whole lot for family forest landowners, but they have forest in their name, so people assume they do. NRCS is a really important, and then over here on the right are some of the resources that are useful to you in helping you accomplish projects, often by giving you cost shares and some technical advice. The NRCS often has cost share. They've accomplished an awful lot of the, yes, NRCS, I spelled it out there. They brought a lot of the money that's been used for oak woodland conservation and restoration. Very important now. They have some money that can help you in your conifers. Soil and water conservation districts, watershed councils, likewise, work with you to help design, develop programs, and often can help you bring in some of the resources, financial resources you need to do that. And then here is some of the information that I help, learn more by coming to classes. Remember those things called workshops and tours? Hopefully by fall, we'll be out in the woods on tours again. Dying to get out there. I produce a couple different newsletters and blogs and information. You can find some of them there. And the Partnership for Forestry Education is probably the easiest place to find a lot of OSU publications, since OSU decided to completely revamp our webpage, and it isn't nearly as nice as, we're not nearly as happy as you are, Michael and Shannon, with yours. Let me tell you that. It's hard to navigate, so just go to the Know Your Forest website and you can search through by topic for a lot of resources, many of which come from OSU Extension, are very pragmatic. So looks like I've just about run out of time. And so now we can sort of have free-for-all questions, or I'll turn it over back to Michael and he can tell me how we're going to do this.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Brad. Great talk, great resources to share with folks.